My son used the $30,000 I gave him for a family vacation to Hawaii, then looked me in the eye at the airport and told me he forgot to buy my ticket. He said it with the same casual tone he might use to say he forgot to buy milk. He told me to just go home. What he didn't understand is that home is where a man builds his life, and where he keeps the phone number of a very good lawyer. By the time their plane touched down in paradise, I had already made a call that would turn their tropical dream into a nightmare. Before I continue, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And be sure to like and subscribe if you believe that respect is something you earn, not something you inherit. The air in the airport terminal was thick with the sterile hum of recycled air and the low rumble of rolling suitcases. It was a sound of departures, of new beginnings. I stood beside a mountain of brand new luggage, the scent of fresh plastic still clinging to the handles. My son Marcus had insisted on it. "We need to travel in style, Dad," he'd said with a wide, bright smile. I'd paid for it all, of course. Just like I'd paid for the first-class tickets, the five-star resort, the entire $30,000 experience. It was, after all, my treat, my gift to the family. Chloe, my daughter-in-law, was fluttering around the kids, her voice a little too high, a little too cheerful. She adjusted our grandson Leo's collar for the third time, a gesture meant to look motherly, but came across as pure nervous energy. Marcus wasn't looking at any of us. His gaze was fixed on the departure screen, his foot tapping a rapid, anxious rhythm against the polished floor. I was the only one standing perfectly still, a small island of calm in their ocean of agitated excitement. I watched them, my son and his wife, and felt the familiar ache of a distance that had nothing to do with miles. They were right here, but they had been gone for a long, long time. We finally reached the front of the line. The check-in agent, a young woman with a professional but weary smile, took our passports. She tapped at her keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen. She handed passports back to Marcus, Chloe, and the children. Then she looked at me, her smile faltering for just a second. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice polite but firm. "I have your passport here, but I can't find a reservation for you on this flight." The words didn't seem to make sense. They floated in the air between us, meaningless sounds against the backdrop of airport noise. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes from the line behind us. I turned to Marcus, a simple question on my face. His own face, the one I had watched grow from a boy's to a man's, was a blank wall. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was suddenly fascinated by a loose thread on his jacket sleeve. "Marcus," I said, my voice quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade. Chloe was the first to react, a sharp theatrical gasp. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, placing a hand over her heart. "There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. I could see it in the way my son's shoulders tensed, the way he refused to look at me. The truth was standing right there in front of me, uglier than any lie he could have told. "Dad," Marcus finally mumbled, still staring at that imaginary thread. "God, I am so sorry. Things have been just insane at work, with the kids and getting everything packed." He finally looked up and his eyes were filled with a shallow, rehearsed apology. "I think, in all the chaos, I forgot to book your ticket." The excuse was so flimsy, so insulting, it barely stood up. $30,000 and he forgot. Chloe immediately jumped into her role as the supportive wife. "Oh, honey, don't worry," she said, pulling out her phone with a flourish. "Let's see if we can buy a last-minute ticket right now. It can't be that much, can it?" Her fingers danced across the screen. I watched her, a seasoned actress playing a part she knew well. Her face fell into a mask of deep disappointment. "Oh, Charles," she said, turning the phone towards me as if to prove her point. "A last-minute seat is almost $3,000, and it wouldn't even be near us. That's just criminal." They stood there, a united front of feigned regret. He the forgetful son, she the helpless fixer. They had practiced this. The thought was as cold and hard as the marble floor beneath my feet. This wasn't a mistake. This was a performance. Marcus took a step toward me, placing a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy, not with affection, but with the weight of his dismissal. "Look, Dad," he said, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were a team solving a problem. "The flight is going to start boarding any minute. There's nothing we can do right now." He squeezed my shoulder. "Why don't you just grab a cab and head home? Get some rest. We feel terrible, truly. We'll bring you back the best souvenir from the island. Go home." The words echoed in the sudden silence of my mind. He was sending me away like a child who had misbehaved, like an inconvenience that needed to be tidied up. I looked past him at my grandchildren Leo and Maya, who were watching with confused eyes. I looked at the new luggage I had paid for. I looked at the life I had given my son, the opportunities, the support, the unending financial safety net. And in return, he gave me 2 words: go home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the drama they might have expected. I simply looked at my son, held his gaze for a long moment, and saw a stranger. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, son," I said, my voice perfectly even. "You all have a safe flight." I turned around and walked away without looking back. I could feel their collective sigh of relief at my back. They thought they had won. They thought they were rid of me. But as I walked toward the exit, my steps were not the shuffle of a defeated old man. They were the measured, steady steps of a craftsman about to go to work. The city slid past the taxi window in a blur of brick and glass, familiar streets looking strange and distant. I caught my reflection in the window layered over the moving landscape. For a moment I saw a stranger, a tired old man with the airport's harsh lights still etched around his eyes. But the feeling passed. The man looking back at me was not tired. He was awake. He was seeing things with a clarity that was as sharp and painful as a shard of broken glass. Go home. The words weren't an echo of my son's voice anymore. They had become my own command, a mission statement. The sharp, hot sting of betrayal had faded during my silent walk out of the terminal. It was replaced by something cold and heavy, something solid. It was the feeling of a tool settling into a craftsman's hand. This wasn't the messy, emotional pain of a family squabble. This was the clean, simple geometry of a problem that needed to be solved. They had made a critical miscalculation. They saw an old man, a wallet, a relic to be managed and appeased. They had forgotten they were speaking to the man who built the house they grew up in brick by brick. They thought they were playing a game against a pawn they could sacrifice. They had no idea they were sitting across the board from the king, and they had just sent him back to his castle. The taxi turned onto my street, and I felt no sadness, no self-pity. I felt a quiet, simmering focus. I wasn't a victim going home to lick his wounds. I was a strategist returning to headquarters. The house was silent, holding its breath in the late morning light. Everything was just as I had left it an hour ago, yet the space felt entirely different. It was the same 4 walls, the same furniture I had built, the same photos of a smiling family on the mantel. But the emptiness was new. It was a hollow space carved out by a betrayal I hadn't seen coming. I walked into the living room and sat down in the armchair by the window, the one with the floral print that had faded from years of sunlight. Her chair, Rose's chair. And in the quiet I could almost hear her voice, not with sadness, but with the calm, knowing wisdom she always had. Rose saw the world with an artist's eye for detail. She noticed the fine cracks in things before they became breaks. Years ago, after Marcus had asked for a significant loan for a car he didn't need, she'd sat with me on the porch watching him drive away. "He has your hands, Charles," she'd said, her gaze distant. "But he doesn't have your patience for the wood. He only wants the finished table." I didn't fully understand it then. I thought it was just a mother's worry. Now, sitting in her chair, her words were as clear as a bell. She also used to say, "Money doesn't change a person, Charles. It just makes them more of who they already are." And in my grief, after she was gone, I had forgotten that. I had mistaken my generosity for love when in reality it was just fuel for my son's weakness, for the entitled man he was becoming. The ache in my chest wasn't just for me. It was for her. For the legacy of hard work and quiet dignity we had built together. This wasn't about a missed flight anymore. This was about the foundation of our life's work. And I would not stand by and watch my son tear it down for a pocketful of ashes. I stood up from her chair, the warmth of the sun on my back. The path forward was no longer foggy with hurt. It was a straight, clear line. I walked into my study, the one room in the house that was more mine than ours. The walls were lined with books on woodworking and history, and the air smelled of sawdust and old paper. The desk, a solid piece of dark oak, was the first thing I ever built for this house. I built it to last. I ran my hand over its smooth, cool surface, feeling the grain of the wood under my palm. This was a desk for making decisions. I didn't need to look up a number. I knew it by heart. I picked up the receiver of the heavy old-fashioned telephone on my desk and dialed. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Law offices of David Chen." "David?" I said, my voice steady. It's Charles Sterling. There was a brief pause, then his tone warmed slightly. Mr. Sterling, it's good to hear from you. Though I get the feeling this isn't a social call. Is everything all right? I got straight to the point. I need you to take immediate action on a sensitive matter, David. I want you to draft the necessary legal documents to temporarily freeze all access to the Sterling Family Trust for my son Marcus Sterling, effective immediately. I could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end of the line. Understood, he said. What is the reason for the review? A fundamental reassessment of the trust's terms and beneficiaries. I said the words feeling solid and true. That will suffice for now. Of course, David replied. I'll have the documents drafted and filed within the hour. When would you like me to send the official notification to Marcus? This was the crucial part. This was the move that mattered. I want the notification sent to his primary email address in the next 5 minutes, I said. He is currently on a flight to Hawaii. He will be in the air unreachable for the next 6 hours. I want that email to be the first thing he sees when he lands and turns on his phone. The line was silent for a moment. I knew David understood everything I wasn't saying. He understood the timing, the strategy, the cold, hard purpose. Consider it done, Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Thank you, David, I replied and gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. I sat there at the desk I had built in the house I had paid for and imagined an email, a silent little digital messenger, beginning its journey across the country. It was the first brick I would lay in the new foundation of my life. As I sat at my desk, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound. It was a rhythm I knew well, a steady heartbeat for a house whose own heart had been ripped out when Rose died. The plan I had set in motion was not born from a single moment of disrespect at an airport. It was forged over years of smaller betrayals, 1,000 tiny cracks in the foundation of my trust. The memories, the ones I had pushed aside, were now returning with perfect, painful clarity. I remember a Sunday dinner just a few months after the funeral. The house was still draped in a heavy silence that we tried to fill with meaningless conversation. Chloe, with her perfect smile, had gestured toward the polished cherry wood case in the corner where I kept my collection of vintage watches. Charles, she'd said, her voice dripping with admiration. Every time I see those, I'm just in awe. They're not just watches, they're history. I explained that each one marked a milestone. The first big contract for the business, the year Marcus was born, the 25th anniversary I shared with Rose. Each one was a chapter of my life bought with sweat and patience. That's when Marcus saw his opening. He leaned forward, putting on his serious business face. You know, Dad, they're just sitting there collecting dust. They're assets, underutilized assets. I just looked at him. He continued, There's this new venture I'm working on, and making the right impression is everything. If I could just borrow one of the more impressive ones, just for a few key meetings. It's about leveraging what we have to build a future. I remember the careful way he chose his words. Leverage, assets, future. They were cold, empty words to describe things that held so much of my past. Son, I said, my voice gentle but firm. These aren't for leveraging. They're for remembering. They stay here. The shift was immediate. The charming smile vanished. He leaned back in his chair, picked up his fork, and started pushing his food around his plate. A 39-year-old man sulking like a child who'd been denied a toy. Fine, he mumbled. Whatever, just trying to make something of myself. He didn't speak another word to me for the rest of the evening. I saw the greed then thinly veiled as ambition. But grief is a fog. It blurs the edges of things. I told myself he was just impatient. I told myself he didn't understand, but now I know. He understood perfectly. He just didn't care. If the incident with the watches was a red flag, then Chloe's online boutique was a wildfire I tried to put out with $100 bills. She called it her passion project, a curated collection of overpriced scarves and jewelry. It lasted 6 months. The first I heard of its failure was a frantic phone call from Marcus. He brought her over that evening. She was a master of stagecraft. She wore no makeup. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she sat hunched on my sofa, looking like a fragile bird with a broken wing. The tears were perfectly timed, rolling down her cheeks as Marcus explained how the suppliers and credit card companies were calling non-stop. I'm so ashamed, Charles, she whispered, her voice cracking. I just wanted to build something of my own. I never meant for this to happen. I've let Marcus down. Her performance was flawless. She wrung her hands, she refused to make eye contact, she radiated shame. I did what I thought a father should do. I was protecting my son from the stress, from the potential ruin of their finances. I was preserving the family's stability. I wrote a check to cover her debts, a check for $50,000. The relief that washed over her face was biblical. She threw her arms around me, sobbing with gratitude. "You're our savior, Charles," she cried into my shoulder. "I will pay you back every single penny. I swear it. I'll get a second job. I'll do whatever it takes." I believed her, or rather I chose to. 3 days later, I was driving through the nice part of town on my way to the hardware store. I stopped at a red light and my eyes drifted to the pristine storefronts. And then I saw her. It was Chloe walking out of a designer handbag store, one of those places where the price tags have commas. There was no sign of the broken, fragile bird from my living room. She was glowing triumphant, a bright orange shopping bag in one hand and a brand new, expensive-looking leather purse tucked under her other arm. She was laughing into her phone, a carefree, joyous sound. The light turned green. The car behind me honked. I drove on, but the image was seared into my mind. The tear-streaked face of the woman who promised to pay me back and the smiling face of the woman who had just spent a piece of my generosity on a new trophy. I hadn't bailed her out of a crisis. I had just paid for the next chapter of her irresponsibility. The watches were a test. Chloe's $50,000 debt was a rehearsal, but the real target, the grand prize, was always the Sterling Family Trust. Rose and I had set it up years ago. It wasn't just a collection of stocks and bonds, it was the sum of our lives. It was the sweat from our brows, the sawdust on our clothes, the late nights bent over ledgers and blueprints, all distilled into a single, powerful legacy for our son. But it was meant to be just that, a legacy. Something for him after I was gone, a foundation for his own family's future. In the last year, however, Marcus had started treating it like a checking account he couldn't quite access. The questions started subtly. A phone call here, a casual query over dinner there. "Hey, Dad." He'd begin, his voice light and breezy. "I was talking to a financial planner and he said it's always smart to know the specifics. Is the trust revocable or irrevocable?" A week later, another question. "Are there any provisions for an early disbursement? For a major once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity?" He was circling it like a shark, prodding for weaknesses in the cage. Each time I'd given him the same answer: the trust is for your future son, not your present. I thought my firmness would be enough. I was wrong. And as I sat there in the silence of my study, the final ugly pieces clicked into place. It was like staring at a series of random disconnected dots and then suddenly seeing the terrifying picture they formed. The persistent questions about the trust. The sudden enthusiastic proposal for a lavish family vacation to Hawaii. The insistence that I pay for it all up front. The final brutal act at the airport. It wasn't a series of selfish acts. It was a single coordinated campaign. The $30,000 vacation was never about family time. It was the bait. It was the cost of getting me to a remote, beautiful place where they imagined I'd be relaxed, off guard, and more willing to sign papers that would give them access to my life's work. Leaving me at the airport wasn't a mistake. It was their arrogant, clumsy plan B. It was the moment they decided that even if they couldn't get my signature, they were still entitled to the vacation I had paid for. It was the ultimate proof. They didn't just want my money. They wanted my life to be over. The next morning, I put on the suit Rose always said made me look distinguished. I gathered my bank statements, printed out a few key emails, and placed them in an old leather briefcase she had bought me for our 10th anniversary. It was a briefcase that had carried contracts for honest work for buildings that still stood strong against the wind. Now it carried the evidence of a foundation that was crumbling. David Chen's office was on the 34th floor of a downtown skyscraper, a world of glass and steel that hummed with quiet ambition. He was a young man, sharp and impeccably dressed, but his eyes held a calm, old-soul intelligence that I trusted. He listened without interruption as I laid it all out on his polished mahogany desk. I didn't present it as a grieving father's tale of woe. I presented it as a case. I spoke of the incident with the watches, establishing a baseline of entitlement. I laid out the financial statements showing the $50,000 transfer to cover Chloe's business debts, placing a printed photo I'd found on her social media page next to it, a picture of her smiling with the new designer handbag posted 3 days after the bailout. David looked at the photo, then back at me, his expression unreadable. I walked him through Marcus's recent persistent questions about the trust. I recounted them word for word. Finally, I told him about the airport. My voice never wavered. I was not there for sympathy. I was there for a craftsman's advice on a structure that was failing. When I finished, I folded my hands on top of my briefcase. I am not here today out of anger, David. I said, my voice low and steady. I am here because the foundation is cracked. The load-bearing walls of respect and trust have been compromised. Before the whole house comes down, I need to know my options for reinforcing the structure. David leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against a legal pad. Mr. Sterling, he said slowly, from what you've shown me, this isn't just a cracked foundation. This is a pattern of consistent, deliberate financial and emotional exploitation. Reinforcements might not be enough. I had expected him to nod and start talking about legal clauses about adding amendments and stipulations to the trust. Instead, David Chen put down his pen and laced his fingers together, his gaze direct and serious. Mr. Sterling, he began, leaning forward slightly. Let's speak plainly. You came in here talking about reinforcing a cracked foundation. But what a good builder does, and you know this better than I do, is determine the cause of the crack. And from what you've told me, this isn't a crack caused by time or pressure. This is a crack caused by poison being mixed into the concrete from the start. The metaphor hung in the air, stark and accurate. If we just add safeguards and new clauses to the existing trust, he continued, you are essentially just putting a stronger lock on a door that your son and his wife have proven they are willing to burn down. You will spend the rest of your years in a state of permanent siege, constantly defending your decisions, your competency, your right to your own life's work. A state of permanent siege. The phrase struck me with the force of a physical blow. That's exactly what my life had become without me even realizing it, a slow, draining battle against entitlement. What you're proposing is defense, David said. I'm suggesting we consider offense. We don't just protect the assets. We change the nature of the legacy itself. We can restructure your entire estate in such a way that it becomes a force for good, a public testament to your and your wife's values. A structure that is legally fortified and serves a purpose so far beyond their grasp that they can't touch it, can't corrupt it, and can't manipulate it. I stared at him. I had come into his office thinking about how to bar the door to my own son. David was suggesting I demolish the house and build a fortress in its place, one whose gates opened to the entire world except for the one person who thought it was his birthright. He wasn't just offering me a legal strategy, he was offering me peace. I looked out the window of David's office at the sprawling city below. So many buildings, so many lives, all built on foundations of one kind or another. I thought of the weak foundation my son was trying to build his life on, a foundation of entitlement and greed. And then I thought of a different kind of foundation. I turned back to David. Do you mind if I make one call? I asked. He simply gestured for me to proceed. I dialed my niece, Amani, my late sister's girl. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and full of energy. Uncle Charles, it's so good to hear from you. There was no pretense in her voice, no hidden agenda, just genuine warmth. We talked for a few minutes about her classes, her professors. I asked her about the community center she was designing for her final project. Her voice lit up as she described it, talking about sustainable wood, natural light, and creating a space that would serve elderly people in the neighborhood. She was talking about building something that would last, something that would help people. She wasn't asking me for a thing. She was sharing her passion. You've got that fire in you, I told her, my voice thick with emotion, just like your Aunt Rose. Tell me something, kid. Do you remember what she used to say was the most important part of any structure? I could almost hear her smile through the phone. The part you can't see, she said without a second of hesitation. The character of the builder. I closed my eyes. That was it. That was the answer. You make me proud, Amani, I said quietly. You make her proud. I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the polished desk. A profound sense of peace settled over me. The path was not just clear anymore. It was illuminated. I looked at David Chen, and he knew the moment he saw my face. The time for deliberation was over. Let's do it, I said. I want you to begin the legal process of completely dissolving the Sterling Family Trust. Then in its place, I want you to establish a new entity. We will call it the Rose Sterling Foundation. David picked up his pen, ready to write. Its sole mission, I continued each word, a brick being laid in place, will be to provide full 4-year scholarships for promising African American students pursuing degrees in architecture and design. And when the time comes, I want the first person offered the position of executive director of that foundation to be my niece, Amani Sterling. 6 hours and 2,000 miles away, Paradise was performing exactly as advertised. The air that greeted Marcus and Chloe as they stepped out of the air-conditioned airport was a warm, fragrant blanket scented with salt and flowers. The resort lobby was even better. It was an open-air cathedral of wealth with a soaring ceiling, lush green plants cascading down the walls, and a gentle breeze carrying the sound of a distant ukulele. They were handed cool, damp towels and glasses of pineapple juice. Chloe let out a little sigh of pure, unadulterated pleasure. "This is it, honey," she whispered to Marcus, squeezing his arm. "This is how life is supposed to be." Marcus, feeling expansive and successful, surveyed the scene like a king viewing his new domain. He had done it. He had pulled it off. He slipped his phone out of his pocket, ready to post the first picture to social media, a casual shot of the infinity pool with a caption like, "Finally, some much-needed relaxation." As the phone connected to the resort's Wi-Fi, a cascade of notifications flooded the screen. Buried among them was an email with a subject line that made his stomach clench. It was from the law offices of David Chen. At the gleaming marble check-in desk, the concierge, a beautiful woman with a flower in her hair, gave them a dazzling smile. "Aloha and welcome to Paradise, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. We just need a credit card for incidentals and the resort fee." Marcus, still trying to process the legalistic jargon in the email on his phone, handed over the platinum card with a confident flourish. It was the card linked to the trust, the one with the practically unlimited ceiling. The concierge swiped it. A small, polite frown touched her lips. She swiped it again. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her smile tightening just a fraction. "It seems this card has been declined." Marcus stared at the word on the screen. Declined. It was an alien concept to him, a word from a different language meant for other people. He snatched the card back from the concierge, his face flushing a deep red. "Run it again," he snapped. "There must be a problem with your machine." The concierge, her professional smile now welded in place, ran it again. Declined. I wasn't there to see it, of course. But sitting in the quiet of my study, I could picture the scene as clearly as if I were sitting in one of those overpriced lobby armchairs. I could see the panic begin to bloom in my son's eyes, the way his confidence shattered like cheap glass. I could see Chloe grabbing his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve, her voice a venomous whisper in his ear. My phone sitting on the desk beside me lit up with the first text. It was from Marcus, an attempt to project control. "Dad seems to be an issue with the card. Probably a fraud alert from the bank. Can you give them a call when you get a chance?" I read the message and set the phone back down. 10 minutes passed. My phone buzzed again, a text from Chloe this time. The politeness was already wearing thin. "Charles, they won't give us the room key. The kids are tired and cranky. You need to fix this." I continued reading my book. The phone calls started soon after. First Marcus. I watched his name flash on the screen, let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, he called again. I ignored it. Then Chloe's name appeared, a furious, vibrating presence on the polished wood. Then Marcus again. It was a frantic digital drumbeat of entitlement turning into fear. The texts became a torrent of raw panic and accusation. "Why aren't you answering? Pick up the phone. Did you do this on purpose? Is this some kind of sick joke?" And finally, the one that I knew was pure Chloe. Her rage unfiltered. "How could you do this to us, to your own grandchildren? You are a cruel, selfish old man. You've stranded us." It was fascinating, really. All the layers of charm and sophistication they wore like expensive clothes were being stripped away, one missed call at a time. Underneath it all was the raw, ugly terror of two people who had just realized the bank they had been robbing their entire lives had finally silently closed its doors. Back in my house, there was no chaos. There was only the scent of lemon oil and the quiet rasp of a soft cloth on old wood. I was in my workshop, the place where I had always made sense of the world by building things. In my hands was a small, three-legged table I had made for Rose on our first anniversary. Its surface had grown dull over the years. I was bringing back its shine. On the workbench, my phone was throwing a digital tantrum. It would buzz violently, skittering across the scarred oak surface, the screen lighting up with their names one after the other. Marcus, Chloe. Marcus again. It was a frantic pulse of desperation trying to invade my sanctuary. I didn't silence it. I let it ring. With every pass of the cloth, I would glance at the screen. The number of missed calls climbed. 10, 27, 54. Each buzz was a demand. Each unanswered ring was an accusation. But they were not calling for their father. They were calling for their banker. They were not worried about my well-being. They were terrified about their access. And in the face of their meltdown, I felt a profound and unshakable calm. I was not punishing them. I was teaching them a lesson in a language they might finally understand. I was teaching them the meaning of the word consequence. The deep red grain of the cherry wood began to glow under my hand, its inner light returning. I was restoring order, that was all. It took them 3 days to get back from Hawaii. 3 days of canceled budget flights, long layovers, and the slow, grinding humiliation of their self-inflicted exile. I knew the moment they arrived. The sound of the car door slamming had a particular fury to it, and the footsteps on my porch were heavy with indignation. They didn't knock. They hammered on the door. I opened it and looked at them. Paradise had not been kind. They looked like they had been shipwrecked. Chloe's expensive cream-colored linen outfit was wrinkled and stained. Her face under a blotchy, fading tan was a mask of exhausted rage. Marcus looked like a ghost. The smug, confident man I had last seen at the airport was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger with dark circles under his eyes and a jaw clenched tight with resentment. They had come ready for a fight, bursting with speeches they had no doubt rehearsed on the long flight home. They pushed past me into the entryway, ready to unleash their storm. And then they stopped. They stopped dead in their tracks, their mouths half open. They were staring into the living room where David Chen sat calmly in the armchair opposite mine. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the leather-bound folder resting in his lap. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. They had come expecting to corner a lonely old man. They found a judge and his counsel waiting for the proceedings to begin. The moment of shock lasted only a heartbeat before it curdled into sputtering rage. It was Marcus who found his voice first, a voice tight with a sense of profound personal injury. "What is this?" he demanded, gesturing wildly between me and David Chen. "You don't answer my calls, you freeze my accounts, you leave us stranded in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with your grandchildren, and now you have your lawyer here. What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing?" He took a step forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "We were worried sick about you. We thought something had happened. We called, and you just ignored us. For what? Because of a simple, honest mistake with a plane ticket. A mistake we felt horrible about." Chloe, recovering her composure, moved to his side, playing the role of the aggrieved mother. "It was the most humiliating experience of our lives, Charles," she said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "To be treated like criminals at that resort, to have to explain to our children why we had to sleep on the floor of an airport. Do you have any idea what you put them through, what you put us through? All because your feelings were a little hurt. They stood there, a united front of indignation, weaving a narrative where they were the victims, the blameless heroes of a story in which I was the cruel, unpredictable villain. They painted a picture of a loving family vacation derailed by the inexplicable whim of a bitter old man. It was a masterful performance. But it was just that, a performance. And I had already read the script. I just sat there, my hands resting on my knees, and let them talk. I let the storm of their accusations break against the wall of my silence. I let the last of their accusations fade into the heavy silence of the room. I didn't move. I just waited until I was sure they had exhausted their supply of righteous indignation. Then I spoke, my voice no louder than a normal conversation, but it cut through the tension like a razor. "Are you finished?" The question hung in the air, not waiting for an answer. Marcus opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. I turned my head slightly toward David Chen. Without a word, he picked up the leather folder from his lap and slid it across the polished surface of the coffee table. It came to a stop directly in front of me. The sound was soft, but it seemed to echo in the quiet room. I opened it. "You seem to be under the impression," I began, my eyes on my son, "that this is about a forgotten plane ticket." I pulled out the first document. It was a bank statement. I placed it gently on the table between us. "Let's talk about this instead. This is a transfer for $50,000 made from my savings account to yours to cover the debts from Chloe's failed business." I then looked at Chloe, whose face had gone rigid. From the folder, I produced the glossy printout of her social media post. I placed it next to the bank statement. It was the picture of her smiling, holding the new designer handbag. And this, I said, is a $2,000 thank you card purchased 3 days later. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. I reached back into the folder. Of course, this was just the largest withdrawal. I began to pull out more papers, canceled checks, credit card statements I had paid off. Each one I placed on the table, slowly creating a mosaic of their financial lives, a paper trail of their dependency. Here is the $10,000 for the down payment on your car. Here is the $5,000 to cover your property taxes last year. And here, I said, letting a thick stack of receipts fall to the table, are the countless smaller transactions. Dinners, clothes for the kids, your club membership. They stared at the growing pile of paper, their faces draining of all color. The righteous anger was gone, replaced by the pale, waxy dread of people who have been caught. You call the airport a simple mistake, I said, my voice dropping even lower. I call it the final arrogant withdrawal from a bank you have been systematically emptying for 5 years. I let the weight of that final statement settle in the room. I watched them, my son and his wife, their eyes darting between the papers on the table, and my face searching for an exit, a loophole, a way to spin this story back in their favor. But there was none. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to David Chen. There's just one more thing, I said, my voice quiet. You call the airport a mistake, but mistakes aren't planned, are they? David? Chen reached into the folder and took out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed email. He held it up. This is a court-ordered copy of an email sent from Marcus Sterling to Chloe. Sterling 1 week before the trip. He said, his voice, the neutral, dispassionate instrument of fact. The subject line reads, the Hawaii Old Man Payout Plan. Chloe made a small strangled sound in the back of her throat. Marcus looked like he had been shot. David continued reading directly from the page. The body of the email reads in part, once we get him to the resort relaxed and a few drinks in him, he'll be much more agreeable to signing the disbursement papers. The $30,000 is a steep price, but the payout from the trust will make it all worthwhile. The words landed in the room and detonated. The color didn't just drain from their faces. It fled, leaving behind a waxy, translucent gray. The masks of indignation they had worn so proudly didn't just crack. They shattered into dust, revealing the raw, twitching greed beneath. There were no more words. There were no more lies. There was only the ugly, naked truth laid bare on the coffee table between us. For a long time, nobody moved. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick marking a second of their new, permanently altered reality. The pile of papers on the coffee table was no longer just evidence. It was a tombstone marking the death of their illusions. Chloe was the first to stir. She rose from the sofa slowly like an old woman, her movements stiff and brittle. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her husband. She looked at the front door as if it were a distant shore she had to swim to. Marcus remained standing, frozen, his eyes fixed on the email printout. He looked hollowed out, a building frame after a fire has consumed everything flammable inside. He finally raised his head and his eyes met mine. I saw no apology in them. I saw no remorse. I just saw the vast, empty ruin of a man who had gambled his entire life on a single losing hand. Then he turned and followed his wife. I didn't say a word. I didn't tell them to get out. There was no need. The truth was now the landlord of this house, and it had already evicted them. I listened to their footsteps retreat. I heard the front door open, and then I heard it close. It wasn't a slam. It was a soft final click. There was no triumph in me, no satisfying surge of victory, just the heavy, profound peace of a storm that has finally passed, leaving a quiet and devastating clarity in its wake. Order had been restored. A few weeks passed in a quiet that was deep and restorative. The silence from my son was no longer a weapon against me, but a consequence he had to live with. During that time, David Chen and I were busy. We were not tearing down. We were building. I met Amani at a small, sunlit cafe downtown, the kind of place that smelled of roasted coffee and fresh bread. She was radiant, full of the easy energy of youth and purpose. Between us on the small wooden table, I placed a new folder. This one was a deep, hopeful blue. I asked you here today. I began sliding the folder toward her because I wanted to show you the plans for my next project. She opened it. her brow furrowed in confusion. Then her eyes widened as she read the first page. I watched her trace the words with her finger, the Rose Sterling Foundation. I told her everything. I told her about the mission to fund the education of young, talented designers and architects. I told her it was built on the idea your Aunt Rose always cherished, that the most beautiful thing a person could build was a door for someone else to walk through. The tears that welled in her eyes were not like the ones I had seen in my living room weeks ago. These were not the tears of a performer. They were quiet, genuine, and full of a profound understanding. "Uncle Charles," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This is everything she was. Everything you both built." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. A foundation needs a strong custodian, Amani. Someone with vision and integrity. Someone who understands that the character of the builder is the most important part of the structure. I let my words sink in. "When you graduate," I said, "I want you to be its first director. I'm not offering you a job. I am entrusting you with a legacy." In her eyes, I didn't see the hungry glint of an heiress. I saw the steady, brilliant light of a builder ready to get to work. I'm back in my workshop now. The house is quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet than before. It's not the heavy silence of absence, but the clean, still silence of peace. For years, I thought my legacy was a number in a bank account, a safety net I was building for my son. I've come to realize you can't build a safety net for someone who is determined to cut the ropes. My son and his wife saw my life's work as a vault to be cracked. They never understood that its true value wasn't in the money, but in the dignity of the work itself. They wanted the finished table, but they scorned the wood, the tools, the calloused hands that shaped it. A true legacy isn't what you leave for people. It's what you leave inside people. The Rose Sterling Foundation, a structure that will build opportunities for others, that is a legacy. What my son wanted was just an inheritance, and I have finally learned the difference. As for me, my work is not yet finished. I'm planning a trip, a real one this time. Not to a sterile resort, but to the coast of Ghana to see the castles and the shores where my own story began long ago. I spent my whole life building a home. Now it's time to see where home came from. I didn't do any of this for revenge. I did it for the thing you can't put a price on. I did it for my own self-respect. Because dignity is the one house you must build for yourself, and you must never ever give anyone else the keys. This story was never truly about money. It was about the slow, quiet erosion of respect that can happen when love is not guarded by boundaries. For years, I believed my role as a father was to be a safety net to provide without question. I learned in the harshest way possible that generosity without respect is simply fuel for greed. A true family legacy isn't a vault to be inherited, but a standard of dignity to be upheld. Protecting your peace and your self-worth is not a selfish act. It is the most vital and necessary work you will ever do. What would you have done in my position, and what do you believe is the true meaning of a legacy?